She found him at the bottom of a dry ravine in the middle of January, a Mustang so broken, so still, that the first deputy on the scene called it in as a carcass. He wasn't dead, but he was blind, both eyes clouded over like frosted glass, 4 legs trembling in the mud, and not a soul in that county believed he had a single day left in him. The woman who climbed down into that ravine to reach him wasn't a rancher. She wasn't a vet. She was a 63-year-old widow who'd buried her husband 8 months before and hadn't spoken more than 100 words to anyone since. What happened next, over the following 9 months, would leave an entire county standing in a field, crying without shame, watching something they couldn't explain and couldn't forget. Before we go any further, I have to ask you something, and I want you to really think about it. Have you ever had a moment where you reached out to something broken, maybe an animal, maybe a person, maybe a version of yourself you thought was gone, and that act of reaching out ended up saving you more than it saved them? Because that's exactly what this story is about. If that question hit somewhere close, leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from, your city, your town, and tell me whether you believe a blind horse can find his way home. I genuinely want to know. And if you're new here, hit subscribe, hit like. This channel exists because people like you want stories that actually mean something. Now, let's go back to January. Let's go back to that ravine. The town of Harlan's Crossing sits in the eastern edge of a high desert valley in Nevada, the kind of place that looks like it was drawn in pencil and never quite finished. Population 840, give or take, who'd moved away since the last census. 1 diner, 1 grain elevator, a post office that doubled as a barbershop on Fridays. The people who stayed in Harlan's Crossing stayed because they were stubborn or sentimental, or simply had nowhere else their bones knew how to rest. Nora Whitfield had lived there for 31 years. She'd arrived as a young bride from Portland, Oregon, following a man named Kenneth, who wore dusty boots and a slow smile, and had promised her that the desert made sense once you stopped fighting it. She hadn't believed him for the first decade. Then she did. Then she loved it the way you love a thing that once hurt you. Kenneth had died in early May of the previous year, a heart that had been quietly negotiating its exit for years, and finally stopped negotiating. He was 67. They had no children. What they had was 40 acres of thin-grassed rangeland, a border collie named Pete, a modest house the color of red clay, and 31 years of mornings drinking coffee on the same porch, watching the same light change over the same mesa. After Kenneth died, Nora didn't fall apart the way people expected her to. She didn't cry at the funeral. She cried later, alone in the barn, pressing her face into the neck of her old mare, Biscuit, who had also recently gone arthritic and slow. She didn't sell the land. She didn't move. She didn't reach out to the grief group that met on Thursdays at the community center. She just went quieter, a degree at a time, like a radio dialing toward static. By January, she was almost completely still inside. Not sad, exactly. Or not only sad, more like evacuated. Like the rooms of herself were swept clean and the furniture was stacked somewhere out of reach. She still fed the animals, still walked the fence line, still drove the 14 miles into town for groceries, but there was a quality to how she moved through those days. Careful, mechanical, her mind somewhere slightly behind her body, that her neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Opal, noticed and worried about in silence. It was Opal who called Nora that Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of January at 6:42, while the desert was still blue with pre-dawn cold. "There's something down in the Lester Creek draw," Opal said. "The Reyes boy drove past it this morning on his way to work. He thinks it's a horse." The Lester Creek draw was a dry ravine that carved through the back corner of Nora's property and snaked down toward the county road. Flash floods had cut it deep enough over the decades that you couldn't see the bottom from the rim without leaning out. Nora put on her coat. She didn't think about it. She just put on her coat and her boots, grabbed a flashlight, and walked out into the cold dark. It took her 20 minutes to reach the draw. The flashlight beam swept down the crumbling dirt walls and landed on a shape at the bottom that was large and pale and completely motionless. She climbed down. The Mustang was a dun, a dusty, sand-colored horse with a dark dorsal stripe running from his mane to his tail. He was lean in the way that suggests a long time without enough food, not a natural leanness. His ribs were visible. His hooves were cracked and overgrown in a way that made her stomach turn, and his eyes, both of them, were opaque. A milky, flat white, like something had simply switched off the light inside. He was alive. She could see the faint steam of his breath rising in the cold air. His flank shivered when she stepped close. She knelt down beside his head in the mud. "Okay," she said. The word came out soft and cracked, the way a voice sounds when it hasn't been used much. She put her hand on the side of his face. He flinched, then stilled. And she would tell this part of the story many times in the months ahead, always pausing here, always getting the same look in her eyes. He pressed his nose very gently into her palm, just for a second, just enough for her to feel it. "Okay," she said again. "I've got you." The deputy who responded to Nora's call was a young man named Aldrich, 26, barely 2 years on the job, from a family that had raised beef cattle for 3 generations and knew horses by temperament and smell. He stood at the rim of the draw, looked down at the Mustang, and pressed his lips together in the flat, diplomatic way people do when they're trying not to say that animal needs to be put down. "You know he's blind," he said. "I can see that. Could be a head injury. Could be ERU, equine recurrent uveitis. Could be a lot of things. Some of those things aren't fixable. I know. Mrs. Whitfield, Nora. He paused. "Getting him out of there is going to be—" "I know what it's going to be," she said. "I need a come along and I need help. Do you have help or do I need to call someone else?" He got her help. It took 4 people, 2 hours, a come-along, and a series of gentle, patient coaxing sounds that Nora maintained continuously, a low, steady murmuring, almost like humming, to get the horse up the ravine wall and onto flat ground. The Mustang struggled once, badly, and went down on his knees, and Nora went down with him, her hands on his neck, her voice never stopping. Aldrich, standing back, watching, would later tell his wife that it was the most quietly determined thing he'd ever seen. They got him up. They got him walking, slowly, unevenly, his blind head swinging with every step, trusting the contact of Nora's hand on his neck as the only information he had about what was in front of him. She got him into the barn. Biscuit, her old mare, lifted her head and regarded the newcomer with calm, pragmatic horse eyes. She walked over, sniffed him twice, and went back to her hay. Acceptance. Nora called the large animal veterinarian in Harlan's Crossing, a compact, straight-talking woman in her 50s named Dr. Lupe, who drove out that same afternoon. She examined the Mustang thoroughly and methodically, and her conclusion was neither cheerful nor hopeless. It was honest. "Both eyes are gone," she said. "Uveitis, probably chronic, probably started years ago and progressed without treatment. There's scar tissue all through the uveal tissue. He won't see again." "I know," said Nora. Dr. Lupe looked at her. "That's the first thing you need to settle in your mind before anything else. He won't see again." "I heard you. What else?" "Malnutrition, moderate to severe. Hoof care, obviously. A few old wire scars on the left foreleg that healed badly. He'll have some movement limitation there. Overall, assuming no internal damage we can't see yet." She paused, recalibrating. "He could have years left in him if someone puts in the work." "That someone is me," Nora said. Dr. Lupe looked at her again, longer this time, and nodded once. Over the next 3 weeks, Nora's days reorganized themselves entirely around the horse. She named him Flint. It was not a sentimental name, and she knew it, but it suited him. There was something in the set of his jaw and the way he held his ground, even blind and half-starved, that felt less like fragility and more like compressed flint, something waiting to spark. Blind horses are not easy. That is not a sentimental statement, it is a practical one. A blind horse cannot be managed the way a sighted horse can be. You cannot wave your arms to redirect him. You cannot rely on visual cues. Everything must come through touch, through voice, through the slow accumulation of spatial memory, teaching the horse the geometry of his world, one step, one corner, one fence post at a time. Nora learned this the same way she learned everything, by doing it, by making mistakes, and by going back to it the next morning. She established routines. She always entered the barn through the same door, made the same sound, a low, clicking tongue tap, so Flint learned to expect her. She built what the books called a track system in the paddock, a series of rope barriers and ground poles that defined safe paths for him to navigate, the way a blind person learns a familiar room. She walked every inch of it with him, dozens of times, her hand on his shoulder, her voice telling him, "Fence here, turn here, water here, this is safe." He learned, faster than she expected. Within 10 days, he was moving through the paddock track with a confidence that made her breath catch, not the blind, stumbling confidence of something pretending, but a real, earned certainty. He knew where he was. She told this to Dr. Lupe on a follow-up visit, and Dr. Lupe smiled the smile of someone who had been in the business long enough to stop being surprised by what animals could do. "Horses are spatial geniuses," she said. "They mapped grasslands for millions of years. He's just remapping. Give him the information, and his brain does the rest." What Nora didn't tell anyone, not Opal, not Aldrich, not Dr. Lupe, was what she noticed about herself during those first 3 weeks. She was sleeping. Not the medication-flat dreamless sleep of grief, but real sleep, the kind with depth. She was eating full meals. She was, and this surprised her most, talking. To Flint, constantly, the way you might talk to someone who cannot answer, but who is unmistakably listening. She told him about Kenneth, about the first time she'd seen Nevada and thought it was the saddest landscape she'd ever seen, about how she'd changed her mind. About how changing your mind about something hard was one of the best feelings she knew. She wasn't sure he understood a word of it. She was absolutely certain he heard all of it. Word travels fast in a town of 840. By February, most of Harlan's Crossing knew that the Whitfield widow had pulled a blind Mustang out of the Leicester Creek drawer and was keeping him in her barn. The reactions were varied and predictable. Some people thought it was admirable. Some thought it was foolish. Some thought it was the grief talking, that she needed something to take care of, and a hopeless horse was filling a hole. Opal, who drove out twice a week on the pretense of returning borrowed books, watched the progress of both the horse and her neighbor with sharp eyes, and said nothing beyond, "He's filling out, isn't he?" Which was true. Flint was. His ribs were disappearing under a coat that was growing softer and shinier with proper feed. He stood taller somehow, or maybe just differently, with less bracing against the world. In mid-February, a teenager named Cassius showed up at Nora's gate. Cassius was 15, the youngest of 3 boys from a family that ran a small hardware store on the main street of Harlan's Crossing. He was in that particular phase of adolescence where the body has arrived before the self has caught up. He was 6 feet tall and 17-year-old sized in frame, but his face still had a child's uncertainty about it, a kind of constant apology. He'd heard about the Mustang. He said he wanted to help. He said he was good with animals. Nora looked at him for a long moment. "You ever worked with a blind horse?" "No, Mom." "You ever worked with a horse at all?" A small pause. "My grandmother had a donkey." Despite herself, Nora smiled. It was the first real smile. Not a polite smile, not a sad adjacent smile, in quite a long time. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee and you can tell me what you think you can do." Cassius became a fixture. He came after school 3 days a week and helped with the practical work, mucking, hauling feed, keeping the track system clear of debris. But what he mostly did, which nobody had asked him to do and which turned out to be exactly right, was sit near Flint and talk to him. He didn't talk about anything in particular. He talked about homework, about his older brother who'd left for the army, about a girl in his class, about a truck he wanted to own someday. Low, continuous, teenage boy rambling, and Flint, who by now had mapped his physical world completely, listened to this voice the way he'd listened to Nora's, with the particular focused stillness of an animal who has replaced sight with hearing and does not waste a sound. It was Cassius who discovered, entirely by accident, that Flint would follow music. He'd been sitting on an overturned bucket in the paddock, earbuds in one ear, phone playing, old country, the kind his grandfather liked, when Flint crossed the paddock on his track, arrived at Cassius's position, and stopped, pressed his nose against the boy's shoulder, and stood there. "Mrs. Whitfield," Cassius called, "I think he likes this song." Nora came out and watched. She took one earbud and held it near Flint's ear. He tilted his head very slightly toward the sound. This small discovery would matter more than either of them knew at the time. That same month, a man named Soren arrived in Harlan's Crossing. He came from out of state, Utah, people said, though some said Colorado, and he pulled a horse trailer up the county road and stopped at the BLM office and announced that he was interested in acquiring wild horses. The BLM officer, a humorless man in his 40s named Beckett, told him that the adoption process was straightforward and the paperwork was on the website. What people in town gradually understood was that Soren was not interested in adoption. He was interested in something else. He spoke pleasantly, drove a clean truck, and asked questions around town with the easy, casual manner of someone who had done a lot of asking around. He asked about wild horse populations. He asked about animals that had been taken in from the range. He asked specifically and by name about a dun Mustang known to have been picked up from the Lester Creek draw. Aldrich heard about it first. He drove out to Nora's place on a Wednesday evening. "I don't want to worry you," he said, which is always the thing someone says before worrying you. "But there's a man in town asking questions about Flint." Nora was standing in the barn doorway. Flint was behind her, head over her shoulder, breath warming the back of her neck. She turned slightly to put her hand on his jaw. "What kind of man?" "The kind that has paperwork, or says he does." Aldrich looked uncomfortable. "Wild Horse and Burro Act is complicated, Nora. If a BLM-tracked Mustang was removed from federal land, he wasn't removed from federal land. He was found on my property, in my draw. The draw runs through my property," she said again, quietly. "I know where my fence lines are." Aldrich nodded. He believed her, but his expression said that believing her and proving it to someone with paperwork were not the same thing. After he left, Nora stood in the barn for a long time. Flint moved around her the way he'd learned to, not bumping, not fumbling, but navigating her the way he navigated everything now, with the quiet precision of a creature who had stopped waiting for his sight to come back and started building a new understanding of the world. She watched him in the low barn light and felt something harden in her chest. Not anger, not fear, but something older and quieter than both of those. She had gotten him out of that ravine. She had put in the work. She had watched him learn to move through darkness with confidence. Nobody was taking this horse. The question of Flint's legal status turned out to be more complicated than Nora had hoped and less catastrophic than she'd feared, which is often the shape of things involving bureaucracy. She hired an attorney, a woman named Soleil, who practiced out of Elko and had handled enough rural property disputes to know exactly which desk to call and exactly what tone to use when calling it. Within 2 weeks, Soleil had established that Flint had no BLM tag, no freeze brand, no record in the National Wild Horse and Burro database. He had been living as a feral horse on private land, possibly for years, drifting through the rangeland margins, invisible to the system that would have claimed him. "He's yours," Soleil said on the phone. "Or he can be. File the paperwork, pay the fee, get the vet to certify. It's clean." "How did he end up in the draw?" Nora asked. "Best guess? Someone dumped him, someone who had him didn't want him, decided the desert was cheaper than a vet bill." A pause. It happens more than people like to know. Nora sat with that for a while after she hung up. Someone who had him didn't want him. She looked out the kitchen window toward the barn. The paperwork was filed within the week. Soren left town shortly after Soleil made a few calls. No one knew exactly what she said, but Aldrich reported that the man's truck and trailer were gone from the motel parking lot by Thursday morning, and he did not come back. Spring arrived in the high desert the way it always did, not gently, not dramatically, but insistently, like someone gradually turning up the light in a room. The creosote went sage green. The dry grass didn't exactly grow so much as wake up. The mesa in the distance changed color 4 times a day. Flint continued to change. Dr. Lupe, on her monthly check-in, stood in the paddock and watched him move through his track and made a sound that was not quite a word, just a sound. Nora understood it. "He's healthy," Dr. Lupe said. "I mean genuinely, fundamentally healthy. Whatever this animal has been through, and it's been significant, he's processing it. He's a tough horse," Nora said. "He is, but he's also—" Dr. Lupe paused, searching for the clinical word and apparently giving up on it. "He's got good psychology. That's harder to rebuild than the body, usually takes longer." What Nora observed, what she wouldn't have known to look for a year ago before all of this, before Kenneth died and the world went still, was the way Flint organized himself around sound. He knew her voice. He knew Cassius's voice. He knew the sound of her boots on gravel versus the sound of her boots on dirt. He knew the difference between the gate latch on the paddock and the gate latch on the barn. He knew what the coffee maker sounded like through the kitchen window and had apparently decided it meant morning, and morning meant her, because he would begin to move toward the barn door, deliberately, calmly, along his track, at the first gurgle of the percolator. Cassius, who had begun documenting all of this in a spiral notebook for a school project on animal behavior, read these observations to Nora one afternoon with the gravity of a scientist delivering significant data. "He's basically built a map of everything he can hear," Cassius said. "Like the whole 40 acres. He knows where everything is by sound." "I know," Nora said. That's actually kind of incredible, Mrs. Whitfield." "I know that too," she said. "Don't stop writing it down." It was Cassius's project that brought the school involved. His biology teacher, a lean, enthusiastic man named Bartow, drove out to see the horse himself and ended up staying for 2 hours. He asked if he could bring a class. Nora said yes, and then felt briefly anxious about having said yes, but prepared for it anyway. The class came on a Thursday in April. 12 kids, 14 to 16 years old, varying degrees of interest and skepticism. They stood in a row at the paddock fence. Cassius demonstrated the track system. He explained the auditory mapping. He described the behavior they'd see. And then Nora opened the barn door and let Flint out. The horse moved into the paddock with the particular quality that had become familiar to her and still startled her. Utterly purposeful, unhurried, reading the world through his hooves and ears and the air on his face. He went to the water trough, knew exactly where it was, didn't search, didn't hesitate, drank, moved to the far end of the paddock, stopped, lifted his head, faced the fence where the students stood. He could hear them, of course. 12 teenagers do not stand anywhere silently. But the effect of the horse facing them with those pale, sightless eyes, head high, utterly still, as if regarding them, was something that nobody laughed at. 2 of the kids moved slightly backward, not in fear, but in the instinctive, wordless response to something that demands attention. A girl near the back of the group said, quietly, "He knows we're here." "He does," Nora said, just as quietly. She didn't plan what happened next. She simply did what she always did. She clicked her tongue twice, the sound, her sound, the one Flint knew, and he turned from the fence and walked across the paddock directly toward her. 12 steps, 13, and his nose found her open hand with the same confidence as every other morning. The girl who'd spoken said, softer still, "Oh." Bartow cancelled the class debrief and let them just stand there for 15 more minutes watching. On the drive back, Cassius told his classmates that Mrs. Whitfield had pulled the horse out of the ravine herself in January, in the dark, when he was barely breathing. He said this the way teenagers say things they think are cool, offhand, like it isn't the most remarkable thing they know. But a few of them wrote it down that night. A few of them told their parents. And in a town of 840 people, a few people telling their parents is enough. By early summer, Nora Whitfield's 40 acres had become quietly, and without any planning on her part, a place people found reasons to come to. It started small. Opal began bringing her Thursday grief group, not officially, not as a program, but because she'd mentioned Flint once during a session and 3 members had asked to see him. They came on a Saturday morning and stood at the paddock fence and watched the horse move through his world with his deliberate, unhurried certainty. Most of them didn't say much. One woman, a retired librarian named Vesper, who had lost her husband to Alzheimer's the year before, said, "He doesn't know he's supposed to be helpless." And then she stood quietly for another 10 minutes. She came back the following week on her own. A farrier from 2 counties over named Aldis, who'd heard about the overgrown hooves through professional channels, volunteered to help rehabilitate Flint's feet over a series of visits. He was an older man, methodical and unhurried, and he and Nora developed a wordless working rhythm. He on Flint's hooves, she at Flint's head, the horse standing with his eyes closed and his ears rotating, locating Aldis by the vibration of his tools, locating Nora by her voice. "He trusts you completely," Aldis said one afternoon, studying the hoof in his lap. "I think it's more that he trusts that I'm there," Nora said. "That's different from trust." Aldis considered this. "Is it?" She thought about it for a long time after he left. Cassius's biology project had been submitted and graded and given the highest mark in the class, but he kept coming anyway. By June, he was coming 5 days a week, not because anyone asked him to, but because he'd begun teaching Flint voice commands, real ones, directional ones, borrowed from seeing-eye dog training manuals he'd found online. Left, right, step up, stop. The day Flint followed the command left and turned correctly at the gate was the day Cassius sat down in the middle of the paddock and had a 15-year-old moment that he would never admit to anyone. He just sat there in the dirt, looking at the horse that had turned correctly because a human voice told him to, and something went through him that was not quite explainable by his biology project. He told Nora about it later, awkwardly, half sentences trailing off. "I know," she said simply. And she did. It was also in early summer that Nora realized she was no longer evacuated. The rooms of herself had furniture again. She couldn't say exactly when it had happened. It was gradual the way spring is gradual, the light changing so slowly that you only know it changed when you think back to January. She still missed Kenneth. She would always miss Kenneth. There was no resolution to that, no horse that fixed it, no transformation that made grief not grief. But grief, she was learning, was not the same as emptiness. It was possible to grieve and also to be full, to miss someone and also to be present. Kenneth had loved the desert precisely because it was honest. It gave you exactly what it was, and if you wanted beauty, you had to learn to find it in severity. She thought he would have loved Flint. She thought he would have spent hours in that barn, just watching the horse navigate his darkness and periodically saying, "damn," in the quiet, appreciative way he said things that moved him. She started leaving the barn door open. In late June, a reporter from a newspaper in Elko drove out. A young woman named Bex, 20-something, notebook in hand, who'd gotten the tip from Bartow, who'd gotten it from one of the school kids. She spent an afternoon with Nora and Flint and Cassius and wrote a piece that ran the following Sunday under a heading that Nora found embarrassing and moving in equal measure. The piece was factual and decent and managed to be neither maudlin nor clinical, which is harder than it sounds. By the following weekend, Nora had received 47 emails. She read all of them. She answered 15, which was more correspondence than she'd had in the previous 8 months combined. Most were from people who wanted to say they'd seen something of themselves in the story. in the horse, in the widow, in the boy with the notebook, in the sound of boots on a gravel path in the dark. One email was from a woman in Arizona who ran a therapy program for veterans using horses. Her name was Mireille, and her email was 3 paragraphs long and direct, and contained no flattery. She asked if she could visit and talk. Nora wrote back, "Yes, come on a morning." Mireille came in mid-July, drove a 6-hour round trip and stayed for 4 hours. She watched everything without commenting, asked questions with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about what she needed to know, and at the end of the visit said, "I'd like to talk to you about something you may or may not want to do. I'm not going to push, I'm just going to describe it." She described a partnership, a small, informal one to begin with, nothing institutional. Veterans from the program in Arizona who were struggling with reintegration, with anxiety, with the particular kind of hypervigilance that made normal spaces feel threatening. She'd been looking for what she called a de-escalation anchor, an environment calm enough and interesting enough and honest enough to hold someone's attention outside their own head. A blind horse, Mireille said, who navigates by sound, who has learned to trust what he cannot see, who functions with competence and dignity in darkness. She paused. "I think some of my people would want to meet that horse." Nora sat with this. "How would it work?" "Slowly," Mireille said. "Everything I do works slowly." Nora looked across the paddock where Flint was standing at the water trough, head slightly lowered, ears rotating in the afternoon heat. "That's how we work here too," she said. The first group came in late September when the high desert had shifted into the particular quality of autumn light that exists nowhere else, low and amber and very clear, the kind that makes everything look simultaneously present and elegiac. There were 6 of them, 4 men and 2 women, ages ranging from 24 to 41. Mireille had prepared Nora with basic information, service backgrounds, general challenges, what to expect, and had also said simply, "Don't have an agenda. That's my only instruction." They arrived in a van and stood in the driveway, looking at the 40 acres and the clay-colored house and the barn with the door open. And they had the slightly braced quality of people who have been in programs before and are waiting to find out what this one will ask of them. Nora shook hands with each of them. She didn't have a speech. She said, "I'll take you to meet Flint. You don't have to do anything except watch." His name was Rafferty, the one she'd remember most from that first day. He was 34, originally from outside of Columbus, Ohio, and he moved through the world with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned to take inventory of every room he entered. He stood at the paddock fence with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and watched the horse with an expression that was professionally neutral. Nora did what she always did. She clicked her tongue. Flint lifted his head from the water and turned toward the sound and crossed the paddock, 17 steps, the same as always, and arrived at her hand. Nora stroked his face, let him settle. Then she moved 2 steps to her right, away from Flint, and clicked again. He followed, adjusted, found her. Rafferty uncrossed his arms. Over the next 2 hours, the 6 veterans moved around the paddock at different paces and in different configurations. Some stood at the fence for a long time before coming closer. One woman, small and deliberate in her movements, asked Nora if she could touch him, and Nora said, "He needs to know you're there first. Make a sound before you reach. Let him hear your hand." The woman made a soft sound, not a word, just a breath, and reached slowly, and Flint turned toward it and let her palm find his jaw, and she stood there for a full minute without moving, her eyes closed. Cassius was there too, sitting on his bucket, watching and taking no notes for once. He caught Nora's eye across the paddock, and she gave him a small nod that meant, "Yes, this is right. Stay." Rafferty, who had been moving along the fence line at a careful distance, eventually stopped near the end of the paddock where Flint was standing alone. He didn't call to Nora. He didn't ask permission. He looked at the horse for a long time, and then, quietly and without ceremony, he said something. Nora was too far away to hear what he said. She saw Flint's ears rotate toward the sound. She saw Rafferty reach out one hand, slowly, and Flint stepped forward and pressed his nose against it, the same gesture he'd made with her in the mud and the cold of January, the first morning. The same offering. Rafferty stood there for a long time. He didn't move his hand away. He looked at the horse's sightless eye, the white, clouded eye that looked back at him without seeing him, and something passed across his face that Nora, watching from across the paddock, recognized, not because she knew his history, but because she knew the shape of it. It was the face of someone who has been seen, not despite the blindness, because of it, because the horse had no judgment. Because the horse was not reading his posture or his jaw or the careful inventory-taking way he moved through rooms. The horse was only hearing him, only feeling his warmth, only knowing that this particular person had reached toward him. Mireille appeared at Nora's elbow, quiet as always. They stood together and watched. "I've been doing this work for 12 years, Mireille said, not loudly, just to Nora. "I've never seen it happen this fast." "He's a good teacher," Nora said. "He didn't teach anything. He just was what he is." Nora thought about that. The afternoon extended. Nobody was in a hurry. The amber light moved across the mesa, and the air cooled, and the horse moved between them, between the veterans who were standing or sitting or walking at the paddock fence, like someone at a slow and very deliberate gathering, visiting each person in turn, navigating by the sound of their presence. The woman who had closed her eyes, her name was Gwen, asked Cassius later about his notebook. He showed her the pages. She read slowly, turned each page carefully, and at the end she said, "You should publish this." Cassius turned red to the ears and said he was in 10th grade. She said, "Okay, publish it when you're in 11th grade." The drive back to Arizona was 6 hours. Mireille texted Nora at 10:45 that night. "Everyone's okay." Rafferty talked for 2 hours in the van. "Thank you." Nora read the text in the kitchen and sat for a while with her phone in her hand. Then she went out to the barn. She always checked on Flint last thing, had since January, and stood in the doorway listening to him breathe in the dark. It was in the week after Mireille's group visited that something shifted in how the town related to all of this. It was small things at first. Eldrick stopped by and helped rebuild the fence along the south end of the property, said he'd been meaning to do it. Opal showed up with a group of volunteers who cleared the track system of debris that had accumulated. Bartow organized a fundraiser at the school, calling it vaguely a community ecology project, in the grant application, which was both accurate and an understatement, and raised enough money to cover a year of Flint's veterinary expenses. The grain store in town started setting aside a discount for what the owner called, without elaboration, Nora's horses. Biscuit had also benefited considerably from the new routine, and people talked. The way people in small towns talk, incrementally, in layers, over time, building a shared understanding of something that had happened in their community, that a widow had climbed into a ravine in January, that a blind horse had been given a second life, that a boy was writing it down, that veterans from another state were driving 12 hours round trip to stand in a paddock and press their palms to a horse's face. None of it was large. All of it was real. The event that would become the moment the whole county remembered came in October. Mireille called and proposed something. She said she'd been invited to present at a regional veterans support conference in Winnemucca, a 2-hour drive from Harlan's Crossing. She wanted to bring Flint. Nora was quiet on the phone for a moment. "Flint has never been off this property," she said. "I know. I wouldn't ask if I didn't think he could do it." Another silence. "What would it involve?" "He'd have to be trailered. New environment, crowd, noise." Mireille paused. "I think he'd manage it, but you know him better than I do." Nora looked out the kitchen window toward the barn. "I know he would," she said. "I'm just—" She stopped. "I've never taken him anywhere. This is his world." "It can expand," Mireille said quietly. They trailered Flint on a Friday morning in late October. Cassius came to help load him, which was not as difficult as Nora had feared. Flint had learned that Nora's presence was a form of orientation, and with her in the trailer speaking to him steadily, he stepped in with only a moment's hesitation, like someone stepping into the dark, knowing someone they trust is already there. The conference was held at a fairground on the edge of Winnemucca. 300 people. Veterans, family members, counselors, advocates, administrators, a large open pavilion with folding chairs and banners, the kind of event that is well-intentioned and slightly exhausting and occasionally genuinely good. Mireille presented first. She spoke about the program for 30 minutes with the economy of someone who had learned to say things once, clearly, and trust that they'd land. She showed photographs of Flint, his first week in the barn, the paddock track, Cassius beside him, the veterans group in September. Then she nodded to the side door. Nora led Flint in. The pavilion went quiet in a way that pavilions rarely do. Not hushed, not respectful quiet. Actually quiet, the kind of collective stillness that happens when something unexpected arrives. Flint moved into the space without hurrying. His head was up, his ears rotated. He was reading a room of 300 people, the same way he read 40 acres, gathering everything through sound and air, building his map. He stopped in the center of the space. And then, and Nora would say later that she didn't give him a cue, didn't make the tongue click, didn't call him, he turned very slowly in a full circle. Not randomly, not blindly, deliberately, as if facing each section of the room in turn, as if saying, "I know you're there. I know all of you are here." A woman in the third row started crying, quietly, not dramatically, just the kind of tears that arrive without permission. Then someone else. A man in the second row pressed his hand over his mouth. Nora stood at the end of Flint's lead rope and felt the whole weight of the past 10 months behind her. The ravine in January, the mud, the cold, the click of her tongue, the 10,000 repetitions of the track, the boy with the notebook, the woman with her eyes closed, Rafferty's hand, all of it settling into the present moment, the way the light settles on the mesa at the end of the day. She wasn't crying. She was watching. She was fully, entirely present. Mireille spoke after, a few more words, a summary, a practical point about accessibility and resources, but the room's attention was still with the horse. It barely mattered what was said. Afterward, in the open air outside the pavilion, the 300 people who'd been inside distributed themselves across the fairground in small groups, talking, and a line formed, completely organically. Nobody organized it. A line of people waiting to stand near Flint for a moment, to put a hand to his face, to say something or to say nothing. Nora stood at his head for 2 hours and did not get tired. A man near the end of the line, older, a career-era veteran who'd come with his adult daughter, stood with his hand on Flint's neck for a long time and finally said to Nora, without explanation, "I didn't expect to feel better today." "Neither did I," Nora said. "First time I met him." He nodded slowly. He understood what she meant. On the drive home, the trailer moving through the desert dark, Nora could hear Flint behind her. The soft sound of his movement, the occasional exhale, the same sounds as every other night in the barn. He was not distressed. He had done what was asked of him, in an unknown space, among strangers, and he had brought himself fully to it, and now he was going home. She drove for a while without the radio. Then she turned it on, old country, the kind Cassius always played, and let it fill the cab. In the trailer, the horse was quiet and steady. October became November, and November became December, and Harlan's Crossing gathered itself into the particular compact warmth that small desert towns find in winter. People stopping longer at the diner, the post office staying open a few extra minutes, the grain store keeping a pot of coffee on the counter that nobody had asked for and everyone used. Nora's 40 acres had become something she didn't have a precise name for, not a sanctuary exactly. That word had too much ceremony, not a program. It wasn't organized enough for that. It was more like a place that had developed a gravity, a place where things were true and visible, and that particular quality, in a world that often arranged itself to avoid both truth and visibility, turned out to be something people needed. Mireille brought 2 more groups before the end of the year. Each time the process was the same: slow, unhurried, no agenda except presence. Flint received each group the way he received every morning, with complete attention, no performance, no variance in his integrity. Cassius, who had turned 16 in November and was saving for that truck with the specific determination of someone who has learned to want things with discipline, finished his notebook and bound it in cardstock and gave a copy to Nora and a copy to Mireille and kept the original. Barto had written a 1-page foreword for it, which embarrassed Cassius intensely and which he read approximately 30 times in private. The school visit in April had become a recurring annual event. 2 classes instead of 1, a proper schedule. A high school kid from a neighboring town had driven over on a weekend just to see the paddock track and had gone home and built one for a rescue horse her family had taken in. She sent Nora a photo. Nora printed it and put it on the refrigerator. Vesper, the retired librarian from Opal's grief group, had become a regular presence. She came on Tuesday mornings, brought good coffee in a thermos, and sat in the barn with Flint while Nora did the morning chores. They didn't always talk. Sometimes they did. The conversations were honest in the way that conversations between people who have lost significant things can be, without the social softening, without the avoidance. "Do you still miss him the same?" Vesper asked one morning, meaning Kenneth. "No," Nora said. "I miss him differently. Like the shape of it changed." Vesper thought about this. "That's progress, I think." "I think it's just time," Nora said, which is maybe the same thing. Biscuit, the old mare, had recovered some of her former vigor under the improved feeding regimen. She and Flint had developed a companionship that was entirely equine and entirely legible. They moved through the same spaces, neither leading nor following, reading each other through proximity and breath. 2 old animals, one sighted and one not, sorting out the same world from different angles. In December, Nora drove to Elko and filed paperwork registering the property as a non-profit. Mireille had helped her think through the structure. Cassius's mother, who was an accountant, donated time. Aldrich sat on the small board of directors without quite knowing what a board of directors did, but willing to figure it out. The name she chose was simple. She'd gone back and forth on it for weeks, and then stopped going back and forth and just wrote it down. Leicester Creek, the place where she'd found him, the ravine in January. The mud and the dark and the shallow breath of a horse that had been abandoned by someone who did not think he could survive. The place where she'd climbed down and found him and put her hand on the side of his face and said, "Okay." The name said, "This is where it started." Not in triumph. In the dark, in the cold, in a place that looked like an ending. I want to say something before we close this story, and I want to say it plainly. Nora didn't save Flint because she was extraordinarily courageous. She didn't have a plan. She didn't know it was going to matter to anyone. She climbed into a ravine in January because she heard there was something alive down there, and she couldn't not go. That's it. That's the whole origin of everything that followed. A blind horse in a ravine. A woman who couldn't not go. Everything else, the track system, the voices, the veterans, the conference, the line of 300 people waiting to put their hand to a horse's face, all of it grew from that one unremarkable act of simply showing up for something that needed it. I think about that a lot. I think about how many things are alive in the dark right now, waiting for someone who can hear them. Not waiting for a hero, not waiting for a program or a strategy or a perfectly articulated plan. Just waiting for someone who will climb down. Nora would tell you she got more than she gave. I think she might even be right. But I also think that's not how the math works when you're standing at the rim of the ravine deciding whether to climb. When you're standing there, you don't know what you'll get. You only know what's down there and whether you cannot go. If this story reached you today, if something in it caught something in you, I hope you'll carry it. I hope the next time you're standing at the rim of something, you remember a 63-year-old widow with a flashlight and a coat, and the sound she made in the dark so a blind horse would know she was there. Okay, I've got you. That's enough. That's always been enough. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs it. Leave a comment with your city. Hit subscribe if you want more stories like this one. I'll see you next time.